You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host Yoel Halevi of HebrewInIsrael.net. I want to thank you for joining me again. I hope you've enjoyed the previous episodes of the series. If you do have questions, you can leave a comment on the website, and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. It just takes time for me to actually go in and see the comments and think of an answer. Sometimes the answer requires a bit more elaborate discussions, and therefore, if we do put something up, just be patient. Another thing is also, if you send me an email, please remember that it does take time to get to everyone's emails, and sometimes also your email might send what I send back to you to the spam, so please check that as well, because sometimes people sit and wait for an answer. They don't understand why I'm not responding. So that's something that's been going on lately as well, so I thought it would be good to bring this up right now. In any case, we are in the Haftarah of Vayeshev, and the Haftarah of Vayeshev actually is taken from Amos. Amos 2:6-3:8, and it's kind of interesting. In this case, sometimes you have discrepancies between different traditions. For the next couple Shabbatot readings, we actually have the exact same reading over and over again. Next time we have discrepancies actually is for Shmot, so that's quite a while from now. And also, there is a chance that I can't guarantee that I'll be able to do all the recordings on time. I'm started a new degree, and there's a lot of pressure to complete different things. So sometimes, and I hope it doesn't happen, but it might happen that I won't be able to get to the recordings on time. So sometimes things might be delayed. I do try to pre-record, but it doesn't always happen. Now, Amos is a fascinating book. I mean, you can't read Amos without really feeling the reality of what Amos is discussing, to kind of really feel the outcry that he has in his book. And Amos, some commentators write about Amos as being the prophet of, if I dare say and use the term, social justice. And when we say social justice, it's very, very important to understand that in our context today, social justice is very corrupt in the way people discuss it, because everyone's looking for the one who is oppressed, because the most basic and most fundamental idea that we find, for example, in the prophets is that you have the wealthy who oppress the poor, which is usually the way things are done. However, throughout time, people have learned to be a lot more moral, and the problem is that now everything is about social status wars. Basically, after Karl Marx, if I may go into that for a moment, who interpreted everything back in the 1800s. I think it was around between 1847. So around that time, I don't remember exactly, he came out with a thesis that deals with the idea that everything that we do as a society is really the war of status between different social groups, and this is why there's a need to destroy all social groups and so on. Again, I'm not an expert in the philosophy of Marxism, but the idea was planted in the Eastern Europe and the Western world that there is a war between classes all the time, and there's a need to always destroy the upper echelon of society because they're always oppressing everyone, everything is always terrible and bad, and so on and so forth. Amos doesn't really say that. Amos describes a reality of his time, but he doesn't point and say, oh, it's the rich versus the poor all the time. He actually points to something much more fundamental in society, and that's moral corruption. And that's the problem that we have today. Today, in the social justice world, people want to always look for an oppressor versus an oppressed. Usually the oppressor is stronger, wealthy, and so on, and the oppressed is usually someone wants to label as weak. Theoretically, for example, I don't come from a wealthy background, and I don't, never have. As a child, we struggled. As a young adult, I struggled. as a young couple, we struggled for a very, very, very long time. And it's only in the last couple of years that we've been able to kind of start emerging out of this struggle, even though it still always is a struggle. But I'm not complaining. I have to be very, very clear. My state today is vastly better than what it was when I was younger. But the thing is that technically, for example, I would fall into the category of a person who's oppressed, which, by the way, I am not. But theoretically. But the problem is that because I come from a Jewish background and we are theoretically, people claim, are say white, I would say, which is a pile of nonsense, but for the sake of argument, then someone's going to try to label that we're always oppressing someone. I'm not going to go into politics here specifically, but there is this overall idea of what oppression is supposed to look like, and it falls into stereotypes. This stereotyping of oppression and seeking to try to find someone who is oppressed all the time is so flawed and so unhealthy that it's creating distorted ways of looking at society to a point where I have seen multiple times people abuse religious status to make the arguments of whatever. And what we're really, really talking about here, and this is the vast difference between someone like Amos, a prophet, who actually speaks the word of God, versus people who come later on and try to reinterpret the word of God by interpreting it also not only into the reality that they're living in, which is not always the same, but also corrupt the actual message. Amos is talking about moral corruption. He's not really talking about rich versus poor. It happens to be that in the old world, if you were poor, you were much more inclined to have less power. And it is still true today. I mean, if you are not wealthy, if you belong to middle class or lower middle class and below that, you have less power, less influence. Everything is about money. And it's true. It's actually a true thing. And it reminds me of that song from The Sound of Music, the money makes the world go around. It's a very, very true thing. But it's not the money, and it's not the wealth, and it's not really the power. It's the corruption that comes, that can potentially come from having wealth and power. It is up to us as people to make the correct decision of how we're going to behave. There's a high tendency, for example, that if you're walking down the street, take something that hypothetically happens. You walk down the street and you see someone who you can define as presumably poor. Now, if you walk by this person and they're asking for charity, for example, and you refuse, are you really a bad person? Are you now categorized as an oppressor? The answer is no. And there are several reasons why the answer would be no. First of all, maybe your state at that given moment is not very good, you can't give charity. Maybe you don't have anything on you right now. For example, I sometimes walk around with no money whatsoever on me. No loose change, no cash, nothing. I just go out of the house and nothing on me. And I've had cases, someone walks up to me and says, I'm really sorry, I have literally nothing on me. If you don't understand what true morality is, then it doesn't matter what the situation is, you'll be labeled as, or someone who doesn't have true morality would label you as an oppressor. Even though it just said, I don't have anything, or I don't want to give you anything, because maybe you're also a liar. You know, for years, for example, in the area I live, there was this really weird thing. There was one lady who walked around town all the time. Every couple of days you would see her, and she kept on saying, I'm trying to get to Afula, I'm trying to get to Afula. Which is a town in northern Israel. It's about an hour and something away from where I live. And eventually someone said, and when you meet her in Afula, she'll say, I'm trying to get to the area of Haifa. And then we tried to discover, at one point someone figured out where she lives, and they discovered she lives about a town or two away, and she goes from town to town collecting money, always saying to people, I'm trying to get to this place, I'm trying to get to this place. If you don't know the context of that specific situation, then there's only two possibilities. Either you refuse, or you give her. to give to that person. However, by giving, you're actually enabling a very, very unhealthy habit here. You don't really know where that money's going to. However, if you don't know details, then maybe you should give. However, in no context whatsoever that exists, unless you're just distorting things, should a person be described as an oppressor because you're not willing to give to someone that doesn't have. It is not your obligation as a person to give to someone if they're lying. It's only when you know as a fact that that this person needs, that if you refuse, you might fall into again, it's very important to point this out, you might fall into the category of someone who is not doing justice, who is not acting in a kind way, but that doesn't turn you into an oppressor. What would turn you into an oppressor is you walk up to that person, punch them in the face, and then take whatever they have, their shoes, their clothing, and stuff like that. That would turn you into an oppressor. Now, good people, which is the majority of mankind, I would say at least people who come from a society where there is order and morality, which, again, morality is still a relative term, people either refuse or will give. No one's going to physically attack. But here's a really interesting case that I saw. Walking down the street in Jerusalem, on King George Street, one of the main streets in Jerusalem, and a man in a wheelchair gets punched in the face. Now, I'm standing 20, 30 meters away, you do the calculation in feet, and I'm shocked. And I was about to rush over to stop this guy from punching this man in the wheelchair. And I start moving towards, and the guy looks at me and says, "No." I said, "What do you mean, no? Someone's attacking a disabled person." He said, No. That person's self-defense. I said, "What do you mean self-defense?" He said, "Yeah, the guy in the wheelchair, he's harassing people in the street. He's actually attacked people with his wheelchair. He's harassed women. The police have removed him multiple times. Multiple times." I looked at this guy, I was completely shocked, and I said, "What do you mean?" Said, "It's true, it's a fact. Notice what he does. Pay attention." I was very surprised, but it apparently was true. Other people confirmed, people who live in the area confirmed. And that's always the problem. You don't always know the full picture. So when we talk about morality, when we talk about social justice, we have to understand that it's not always about extreme good versus extreme evil. It's not always about a war of classes. It's not always about, I'm oppressed. There's a very, very strong thing today right now, and I've been wanting to talk about this for a very, very long time. I might have mentioned this in another previous recording, but I really want to bring this up, that there's this culture of wanting to be oppressed, the culture of wanting to be the underdog, always identifying with the underdog, which is a very, very unhealthy culture. If you see a true situation that you know as fact is in a situation of oppression, then fine, act upon it. But if you're dealing with a situation where someone has manipulated to make it look like oppression, cases of narcissists, I personally have had discussions with people who are married to narcissists, and they openly say they pretend to be nice people. They pretend in front of everyone that they're the ones being persecuted, that they're the ones suffering. And I've heard horror stories, cases of abusive husbands or abusive wives that kept on saying, "Oh, you're doing this to me," and they manipulate the other side to feel guilt because they recognize who's a good person, they hone on them, and then they exploit that for the entire duration of the marriage. And that's always the problem that we have. Do you always know what true justice is? And this is why when you pick up a cause, you should always check very deeply to see what this cause really is about. But what Amos, going back now to Amos, what Amos is really talking about is true justice that has to do with, first of all, analyzing our own morals, our own behavior and our own morals as people. And this is what he points out. He doesn't point out, oh, he didn't give charity to that group, or you didn't give money to that person down the street that you know that may or may not need food, but then apparently you discover they have a gigantic television in their living room somehow. To know what to correctly do in your society, the first and foremost thing that has to be done is learn to be charitable and good to the ones who surround you. That's the first stage. Before you run out to all those battles in different places around the world, whatever that situation may be, first of all, check if your own society is in check, if your own household is in check, if your own neighborhood, and then your city, and then your own country. Don't pick up a war somewhere else before, or a struggle somewhere else before you know everything's in order where you live. Now, it doesn't mean that human beings in strong countries shouldn't help people, human beings in weaker countries. But you have to have some kind of proportion to it. We live in a world that people want to be compassionate, but compassion's being corrupted as well. People don't know what compassion really is. That's a very, very unhealthy thing. Now, I'm going through these thoughts because I'm very bothered the last couple of years with fake compassion, fake behavior. And I keep on wondering, where can I find a real answer of how to correctly behave in different situations? And it brought me back to the Bible, it brought me back to the Tanakh. The Tanakh contains wisdom of generations, of people who were thinking, who analyzed the reality around them, dealing with things that we deal with to this very day, questions that we have to this very day as well, in a lot of different aspects. Sometimes the answer is unclear because the people who lived during the times of the Bible, the answer wasn't 100% clear. Sometimes the pondering is the pondering of people, which is another discussion that might have to be done about, how much of the Bible you can say is God spoke to someone, how much of the Bible is someone sitting and thinking about it, putting things into words. And I remember the first time I sat in a classroom several years ago, and my professor gave us something from Amos, and she said to us, look, you have to actually realize that there are some sections here which is God speaking to Amos and Amos passing on the words, and in some places it's Amos talking out loud from his own volition. But putting that subject aside, I'm sorry to bring this up and then shelving it, because this is a discussion that does need to exist. Because there might be some overreach that some people create when it comes to discussing the Bible, which I think maybe damages the real discussion about the Bible. But this has to be something maybe to not even a podcast by myself, maybe get someone to do it together with me and discuss this as two different people, maybe even three if it's possible. And I actually have a friend in mind that I might actually ask him if it's possible to do something like that with him. But in any case, so be prepared. It's going to happen eventually. This is a very, very important discussion I want to get to eventually, because it's a really, really interesting thing. But Amos, what he does is he focuses on real actions. He focuses on real things, and he says, and this is the first chapter and a bit of Amos start with what's known as the structure of the 3 and 4. Describing 3 and then pointing out a fourth. There's a lot of discussions about, is the fourth really the actual sin, or is the fourth the thing that tips everything over, or are all of them really that important? And the whole idea of 3 and 4 is just an intensification. There's different opinions about this. But he says, we start from chapter 2, verse 6, and he says, כה אמר אדוני על 3 פשעי ישראל ועל 4 לא אשיבנו. This is the Lord, and the 3 sins of the 3 Pesha is not really sin. Pesha is almost like a criminal act. So I would say the 3 crimes of Israel, and 4 crimes I will not return to them. I will not bring them back to me. Al michram bakesef tzadik ve'evyon ba'avur na'alayim. So number 1, or actually 1, 2, and 3, and then we have the 4th later on. It says, because they sell the righteous for money. Now, selling the righteous for money can be slavery, can also be situations where there's bribery going on in courts and so on. Ve'evyon ba'avur na'alayim, and evyon is a poor person, similar to some people, but the Ebionites, evyon is the actual Hebrew word. It means someone who is of a lower class of society, for a pair of shoes. Shoes were very important, by the way. Today, most of us have shoes, at least 1 or 2 pairs, but back then production of shoes was much more complex, and some people walked around barefooted all the time. But for the wealthy, shoes were a basic thing. I mean, you had your attire and you had to wear shoes. It says, "Hasha'afim al afar eretz berosh dalim." So sha'afim, you can confuse the word sha'af with to breathe in, but it actually means to crush It's a different root, because linshom velinshof, or lishof avir, to breathe in, but really the root itself here in context means something completely different, which means to crush to the earth. Berosh dalim might be translated grinding the heads of the poor in the dust. It's an idea of stepping upon someone. We actually have in the book of, I think it's Isaiah, where he says that Babylon wanted Israel to go down to the ground so he can step on it, and God says to Babylon, no, you're going to be on the ground and I'm going to step on you. It says V'derech anavim yatu, and derech anavim yatu sounds like as if almost like a physical thing of pushing people off the pathway. Some translations saying pushing the lowly out of the way. Get out of my way. I'm more important than you. It says ve'ish ve'aviv ilchu el hana'ara leman halelet shem kodshi, and a man and his father go to the young girl, to the young woman, to profane my name. And this is obviously some kind of prostitution, not very, very clear, but it shows not only corruption in society in the sense of people mistreating one another, but even amongst the families themselves, there's a moral disorder here where a father and his son are going to the same woman to lay with her. This is obviously for a sexual act. And it says, "Valgadim havulim yatu etzel kol mizbeach." They lean next to the altars, usually to bring their sacrifices. You're coming into temples, which are presumably for me. And again, it's a whole discussion about what was going on in the north. But they lean on clothing that was taken forcefully because of a debt. Ve'yen anushim yeshtu bet Elohem, and they drink wine that was stolen. Wine which is either taken as a fine or bought with money that's a fine. They drink next to the houses of their gods. Or Elohehem is actually their God. Now, it's a big question here if he's referring specifically to idol worshipping. He doesn't really mention it here in this specific segment. But there is a question here of what exactly does he mean in some of these references to cultic settings. Cultic setting means temple worship. And there's a possibility here that when he says Elohehem, he just means their God, and they're presumably appearing before the God of Israel. And they pretend as if what they're doing is perfectly fine because the ritual is much more important. The temple is much more important. And we see this theme also with Jeremiah, which says, Echad Adonai, Echad Adonai, Echad Adonai Hema, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord, they say, or no longer there'll be need for the Ark of the Covenant, because everyone's missed the point of why do we have a temple? Why do we have these rituals? It's about honoring God. It's about doing God's will, not that we're going to show up and push these buttons, like for example, as I always say about Bilam and Balak, where they thought, we can bribe God. Okay, we're going to push all these different buttons and look important. No, it's about honoring God in a respectful manner. But if you're going to bring things which are stolen, things which are done, things that you acquire through a corrupt way and present them before God as your gifts, then God is not interested because He knows where it comes from. And He says to them, and He reminds them, and He goes, remember, you were oppressed as well, you were foreigners as well, you were poor as well. And He says, Vanochi ishmati et ha'emorim pnehem. This is verse 9. And I have destroyed the Amorite before them. Asher kegova harazim govho, who is high as the height of cedars. V'hasonahu ka'alonim, and is tough or strong like oaks. V'ashmid piryam mimal v'shorashav mitachat, and I will destroy his fruits from above, the leaves, the alava we say in Hebrew, the leaves from on top and the roots from beneath. And this is the reminder, you were also sojourners. V'anochi aleti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, and I brought you out from the land of Egypt. V'olech etchem b'midbar 40 shana lareshet eretz ha'emorim. I made you walk. I humbled your fathers in the desert so they know what it means not to have. They understand that I am their God, I am their Father, and I provide for them. And everything that you have as a people, I gave to you. If you need anything, just turn to me and I'll provide it for you. You don't have to go around stealing from others. I give to you, and this is a very important thing. And this is why I said, when you want to have wealth but not be corrupt, if God gave you and you are wealthy or you have the ability to help others, maybe the reason you have all of this is to help others as well. You start with your family. You seek people inside your family. We have this rule in Judaism. Judaism has a lot of things to offer which are very wise. You start off first with your family, and then your friends, and then your city. If you go around, I have a friend who seeked someone poor to give them. He was looking for a widow that needed help, and I don't want to exaggerate, but what he described to me was a person who really, really wanted to help. God gave to him, and I had this very inspiring discussion with this friend. I have chills every time I think about this discussion. This person went out of their way to find someone to help. Really tried, because there was nothing in his area. So he went out, he and his wife, and they started seeking someone outside. And they found someone in the end. And they gave to them and helped them. Put shoes on the children's feet, clothe the children, feed the children. My friend, I think, had the right idea of what happens when God gives you wealth. Help others. And Amos is saying, you have. You don't have to take from others. You have. You don't have to redistribute wealth. If you have, there are mechanisms of helping others. You don't have to start yelling out oppression, oppression. It's not real. None of it is real. But what is real is when you see a need, then take care of it. Don't invent needs. Don't lie about doing justice in the world. Don't show up at the temple and say, oh God, we bring you the sacrifice, and the sacrifice was stolen from someone who doesn't have. It's pure corruption. It says, and God proves that he was faithful to Israel. Not only helped them in the desert, it says, Va'akim b'nechem linvi'im, u'mbachurichem linzirim, and I raised from your sons prophets, and from your choice men, Nazarites. It's an interesting thing what exactly the position of a Nazarite is, but Nazarites are people who choose to be closer to God, and they elevate to the level of a Kohen through the practices, and some of them might have been even prophets. But even if not, they had a special status as holy men and women. It says, Ha'afin zot b'nei Yisrael nu'um Adonai. He says to them, isn't this true? Have I not done these things? Have I not proven myself that I can provide to you, take care of you, help you? No, you have to go and steal from really truly oppressed people. Destroy anything that's good. So he says to them, "V'tashku et haneviim yain, v'al haneviim tzivetem lemor lo tinaveu." You forced the Nazarites to drink wine, something which is prohibited on them. Remember, it's Numbers 6, if I'm not mistaken. And the prophets, he said to them, do not prophesy. That actually might be something that came out from the king's court, because we actually have, Amos goes through this personally when he has a discussion with the priest of Bethel, and he turns around, the priest of Bethel says to him, he goes to the king and tells the king that this prophet Amos is talking evil of him. So he turns around to Amos and says, run to Judea, go eat there. Your prophecies are really just you making money off of things. And the truth be told, there were people like that. There still are people like that today, who pretend to be spiritual leaders, to be prophets of sorts, and so on. And they're turning around to everyone saying, provide to me, and I'll give you prophecy. I'll give you good prophecy, good tithing to you. Like the whole story with presumably King Achav and King Yehoshaphat, when they had 400 prophets, I think it was, stood before them, saying, you will defeat Aram. And this one prophet, Michaihu, son of Yimla, I think it was. It says, no, it's not true. None of that's true. So he says to them, your burden, he says to the Atinem anochi me'ik tachtechem, kasher ta'ika agala mele'ala lah amir. Behold, I put a burden upon you. Okay, there will be a burden beneath you because of the weight on your shoulders. As the wagon is burdened, as a wagon full of hay is burdened, loads and loads of acts that burden more and more and more. And God is saying, you've burdened me. We see this idea of burdening God in different places. But tal'uti, there's a prophet, I can't remember exactly where it says, you have made me tired with your behavior. And God says to them, as part of the Talion law, the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, you've burdened me, I will burden you. And what is the burden here? Because we have to remember, this is a period of the time Amos lived in the 8th century. This is when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was rising and attacking and destroying and enslaving everyone. It says, Va'anas ve'avad manos mikal. Sorry about that. Anas is a I had avad and manos kind of collided when I was reading, which is, by the way, something that happens, for example, with scribes. They might merge words and stuff like that, which is an interesting discussion that we might have someday. But sometimes when you read, you merge words and you accidentally get a weird version of a text, which is something I've been studying lately when it comes to text versions, Dead Sea Scrolls, Masoretic text, and other things, Septuagint. I have professors currently training us in that area. So it's kind of amusing that happened. But it'll be interesting to bring this up. Maybe I'll discuss this with one of my professors about this issue of maybe sometimes the merging happens because they're just misread. When it gets avad manos mikal, the ability to flee will be lost to the person who's usually light on their feet. V'chazak lo yametz kocho, and one who is strong will not be able to exercise his strength. V'gibor lo ymalet nafsho, a warrior, a person who is a hero, a person who of his might will not be able even to flee his own life. It says, "V'tofes hakeshet lo ya'amod." He who grabs hold of a bow will not be able to stand, because usually when you fire a bow, unless you're firing a gigantic Chinese war bow, usually bows are smallish, and you fire them when you stand. V'kal beraglav lo yimalet, and repeating a bit the idea, v'avad manos mikal. Okay, this is v'kal beraglav lo yimalet. This is verse 15. He who is light on his feet will not flee, will not be able to flee himself. V'rochev hasus lo yimalet nafsho, and even one who rides a horse will not be able to flee. V'amitz libo b'giborim. So this is a bit of a repeat what we saw earlier in verse 14. So verse 16, 15 15, 16 expand verse 14 a little bit. It says v'amitz libo b'giborim, and he has a brave heart amongst the brave. Arom yanus bayom mahu nu Adonai. He will flee naked on that day. That's the word of the Lord. Fleeing naked. First of all, nakedness is a form of humiliation. They used to sometimes do is undress captives and humiliate them in front of everyone, especially if it was an important warrior. Sometimes even presenting someone's head was something that was practiced as well. But fleeing naked means that they will flee with nothing on them. They will be as if caught by surprise in their tent when they're asleep at night, and they had to flee as they are. Kind of reminds me of a small funny story that we had when I was in the army. Not of someone fleeing, someone doing the exact opposite. There was a guy in my I think the term in English would be a platoon, who we were called for a security breach that happened apparently. And everyone had to jump, and the thing was that you actually had to get dressed in about 7 seconds, 10 seconds, something like that. I think my own personal record was around something like 20 seconds. But you had to always sleep with your socks on, and you always had to have clothing very close by and everything. And we had a method with our shoes that you were able to tighten up your shoe in a split second, where you just pull one string and everything locks up. And we were called out for a security breach, and we jumped out and everything. And at the end of it, we were standing to check everyone's back and everything. What we realized is one of the guys didn't get dressed fast enough, but he was so prepared to engage that he jumped as he was, and we discovered he was standing in his underwear. And he was actually commended for that, because he was willing to jump into bushes and everything and be injured, just to be able to protect his unit, to protect people. So, and it was a very, I would say, somewhat of a brave act, pursuing the enemy in your underwear. So that was the exact opposite of this. This was a very, very brave guy that I knew even before I went into the army. Unfortunately, my service in the army was cut short at one point because of something that happened. Accident that I had that shortened my service, but I got to meet some really, really brave people, true heroes, people of real valor when I was in the army. And so it's the exact opposite. He says, the opposite of that is when you flee in your underwear, you flee from the battlefield, and you drop everything that you have, maybe even drop anything that identifies you as a soldier of any sort, to make sure no one can identify you either. So there are people who do that, and the people who charge into war, even if they're only wielding a sword in their hand to protect their own people. So then we carry on to chapter 3, and we only have a few verses in chapter 3. And it says, Shim'u et hadavar hazeh asher diber Adonai alechem Yisrael. Hear this word which the Lord has spoken upon you, children of Israel. Interesting, he used the term Bnei Yisrael. Remember, he mentioned the Exodus earlier. So instead of referring to them as Israel, he says Bnei Yisrael, to remind them of the past. Al kol hamishpacha asher ha'eleti me'eretz Mitzrayim lemor, upon all the family which I have brought up from the land of Egypt, saying, this is why he uses the term Bnei Yisrael. He says, Rak etchem yadati mikol mishpachot ha'adama. Only you I know, yadati is a past tense, but really I know from all the families of the earth. Al ken efkod alechem et kol avonotechem. Therefore I will charge upon you all your iniquities, all your sins. With great choice comes great responsibility. Play on the famous Spider-Man statement of with great power comes great responsibility. I've been saying this for many years now, that being chosen is not just being, oh look, God loves me, I'm God's chosen one. It's also about taking the responsibility because you are the representative of God on earth, acting in God's way, doing justice in the world, doing the tzedek mishpatu meisharim, doing the justice, the practice of law and the right ways, which is an ideal which appears in all the ancient Near East. In the Misharum, for example, is Mesharim, Misharum. Misharum is the Akkadian term. And he says to them, I chose you. I chose you because I saw something in your father. I saw something in parts of your people. I saw people that can well represent me in the world. But this behavior, this disgraceful behavior, why would I want to continue choosing you? Go to the temple, pretend. If you pretend, God says, I can see into people's hearts. I know if their heart is true. Your heart is not true. So why would I continue choosing you? The problem is that people sometimes think, I'm chosen, therefore anything I say is true. But God has a mechanism. If you look at the structure of Israel, you see there's a king, there's a priesthood, and there are prophets. And they all balance one another. Israel has to get rid of false prophets, but a true prophet has to tell everyone when they're wrong. There's a mechanism. But that's why they got rid of the prophets. That's why it says earlier, you tell the prophets don't prophesy because it was an uncomfortable truth for them. Because it tells them to their faces, you're doing something wrong. It doesn't give people the power to tell others always that they're wrong. We have to discuss things. We have to try to seek the truth together. If there were a person that we can bona fide as a prophet and say, okay, give us a sign that we see throughout the Bible, where they say, they prove themselves to be true prophets, then we can listen to them. But if we have a difference of opinion about certain things in the Bible, in the Torah, or in the prophets or the writings, then we have to sit down and discuss things, not just point at one another and say, oh, you're wrong, and then feel as if we know everything and just walk off and say, obviously I'm right. No, that's the incorrect way of looking at things. We have to discuss things. We have to try to find a common core principle that we can work off of, and then see how we understand things together as a group. And he says to them, you're a family, atem mishpacha, al kol ha-mishpacha. I know you from all the families. What is mishpacha? Mishpacha is the families. The people have to be together. If you're not with your family, I haven't lived with my blood relatives except for my wife and children. I've been by myself for almost 20 years. My parents left Israel, and I've been here technically by myself for almost 20 years. When you see your parents once in 4 or 5 years, I have to say it's a very revealing recording this time. But I've been by myself. If you've never experienced the whole idea of literally being by yourself, you don't fully understand. It taught me, at least on my level, it taught me to listen to my brothers when we disagree, to still try to find a way that we can find some kind of an answer, because I don't have a lot of family, and being able to spend time with my brothers or with my parents is always a blessing, even though sometimes there can be arguments. But we try to find that core principle that even if we disagree on something, and we do, we have disagreements, we still remember that we are still family. And I think it's a very, very important thing. If we define ourselves as the children of Israel, no matter what your background is, if you define yourself as Israel, then you have to respect that idea of being a family. And even if you disagree with someone from a different approach in the family of Israel, you still have to remember that we are family. You can't just go around pushing them out of the way, saying, I'm right, and that's in condemn them. Do you condemn your own children? Do you attack them? Do you hurt your parents? Of course not. There's a body known as the family of Israel. And attacking is attacking oneself. If you hurt that person, you're hurting yourself as well. You're only weakening yourself by behaving in that way. And this is one of the things, again, why he says family as well. So he says to them, you have to understand that you're a family, and I am your father, I am your king, and I govern everything. And therefore, everything that you're going through, I'm putting my eye on it. And he gives them, there's a structure known as the 7-8 structure. We had 3 and 4 earlier. Now we have a structure of 7 and 8. So verses 3 to 6 have 7 examples. And then there's an 8th on the verse 8. But he says to them, everything that happens with you, everything that you do, I am putting my eye on you on these things. It's quite possible that we're seeing a bit of a secret discussion here, an internal secret discussion in regards to a debate that was going on. Is God really keeping his eye on people? Is God really acting in the world that we live in? And he says to them, of course I am. It could be that there are people that behaved in the way they behaved because they felt the world was random. And the poor felt that the world was random because they felt that no one's doing anything for them. And one lonely prophet stands there and says, you're not doing this right. And you have to continuously have hope because God is actually acting upon these things. It says, if do two go together, if they do not agree upon this? Does a lion roar in the forest and he doesn't have any prey? Whether there were lions and other animals in the land of Israel, there were even elephants in Syria in the Bronze Age. A surprising thing that I learned a couple of days ago. It says, would a kfir, which is a young lion, raise his voice from his place of dwelling if he has not caught something? Number 4, would a bird fall into a trap on the earth if there's no actual trap there? It's a very interesting verse, by the way. If you look at a translation, for example, he says to them, does a bird get caught in a trap on the ground if it hasn't been baited? The problem with the term mokesh has a specific meaning in modern Hebrew that can be very, very confusing. It says the bird is not attracted to a trap unless there's something to attract to it. Would a trap jump out of the earth? Basically, it's a trigger, and it won't catch anything. If it's triggered, there's something there. Number 6, if a shofar is sound in the city and the people are not fearful, you have the odd person who doesn't care, but most of the time if you hear the alarm, you jump. I, for example, lived in Israel, grew up here in Israel, native born. There's always this massive confusion of like, wait, he speaks English pretty well. And so people start confusing where exactly I come from, but I'm actually Israeli, and I live here in Israel, and my culture is Israeli, and Hebrew is my first language. And bringing the reason I brought this up is because I grew up here in Israel when Scuds were fired from Iraq, when Hezbollah was sending missiles. I actually got away from taking I think in America it's called an SAT in biology, the state exams, because there was the Operation Grapes of Wrath, I think it was going on up in the north, and I went to school even more north than where I live these days, where I grew up, and where I live today is where I grew up, and I remember the sirens and you jump from it. And if you're occasional nonchalant person who doesn't really care, but most of the time people do care. says, Im tieh ra'a ba'ir, this is number 7. V'Adonai lo asa. Now he's getting to the real point. He says, if there is an evil in the city, if there's a downfall, a disaster in the city, and the Lord did not do it, God is in control of everything. It says, verse 7, Ki lo ya'aseh Adonai Elohim davar. The Lord God will not do anything. Ki im galas sodo el avadav v'neviim. If he does first of all reveal the secret. The sod, the term sod is the assembly. It is the secret of God, where he presumably assembles angels or someone he consults with. In this case, you can say it's the prophet. God is consulting with him, telling him what he wants to do. It says, if the Lord God doesn't do something, if he does not reveal his will to his servants, the prophets, he says to them, everything is under supervision. Nothing is random in the world. It raises questions of free will, but we still need to understand that the principle of randomality does not exist. And he ends with these words, and he says to them, Aryeh sha'ag mi lo yira. When a lion roars, who does not fear? Adonai Elohim diber mi lo yinnaveh. The Lord God speaks, who will not prophesy. And there are 2 points to this. The first one is the idea of there's no randomality in the world. And God is judge of everything, but he's also pointing back to something that we read earlier, where he said, you tell the prophets not to prophesy. He's telling them, because he's talking to them, and it might be something that will happen in public, where he spoke to the people, and they looked at him and gave him faces, and he says, there's nothing you can do. God has decided, God has spoken, and therefore it's going to happen, and I am speaking his words, and I cannot stop prophesying. If God spoke, I have to say something, I have to speak out, because this is my job as a prophet. This is what Amos says. The subject of prophecy itself is a very, very difficult subject, overall, and I spoke about this a little bit several years back, but maybe also a discussion about prophecy and prophets in the ancient world would be something worth talking about, but I have to do a lot of research before I do that, and there's some discussions that develop later on. But I have been thinking about also doing a recording about the whole subject of prophecy and understanding prophecy in a context of a realistic world, kind of like, understanding that people lived in the ancient world not too differently than we live. They started to go to work, they started to do things, and there were people who were prophets, and the dilemmas people had when it came to prophecy and so on. But if we look into this, you have to also understand that there were people who turned around to prophets with complete disbelief. They said, who cares if you're a prophet? Look at, for example, Eliyahu. He was a true prophet of God. He did different acts, and people still dismissed him. They had moments of like, oh wow, he's a true prophet, but they dismissed him. I would say if we walk away from these prophecies, I would say that we need to walk away with the notion that we need to understand that God always has his eye open. And no matter what our will is, no matter how we interpret things and how we want to feel about things, at the end of the day, it's still about him. It's still about God making the decisions and us having to look to him to know what we're supposed to do, and correcting ourselves when correcting is needed, and acting in compassion the same way that God acted in compassion. Even after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, he still sent them away, but he sent them away with clothing, which is considered to be by some an act of compassion. We need to be compassionate to one another and seek true justice, not fake justice, not some construction that we invent, but a justice that's based on God's will. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And again, questions of morality are always very, very complex, and this is why reading through Amos is a very, very good place to kind of get an idea of what morality is. Also, I want to remind you, if you want to help with the research, help with producing things, you can click the donation button. I don't push this, but it does help to acquire books and to take time off of work to be able to sit in a library to research as well. And again, don't forget to share. Don't forget to act in compassion to one another as well. Not that I'm suspecting the listeners don't have compassion, but we need reminders sometimes. And I pray that we learn from these words to do true justice, true moral behavior with one another. Kol Tuv.